reach people by landline, by cell phone, by text message, and by email and by postcard. So basically every kind of method under the sun to collect interviews either by a phone interview with a live interviewer or online. And we were able to actually reach 567 voters in your community. That's a really kind of astounding response rate given the underlying sample size. Often for entire states, we do 400 to 600 interviews. So this gives us a really robust look at what your voters are thinking. We limited this to likely November 2024 voters in the city. It's a fairly broad turnout model, and within that, we can kind of look at different scenarios overall. And we've got some comparisons to a research project we did in 2020 that was more specific to parks in partnership with the city that we may refer to a few times. And generally, overall, what we see here is a lot of really good news. There are generally positive opinions about the city and how the city is run. Folks are quite supportive of a ballot measure based on language alone. And there's some good findings and evidence in terms of the types of programs and services the city provides that people most value most highly when it comes to spending their tax dollars. So starting with a political context in your city more broadly, we ask this kind of classic pollster question: are things headed off on the wrong track, or are they headed in the right direction? You can see we asked that in January 2020 as well. At that time, 54% were feeling optimistic and just 22% felt things were headed off on the wrong track. Now we're looking at 48% saying things are headed in the right direction and 33% off on the wrong track. So that right direction number has gone down, the wrong track number has gone up. But I do these surveys across the country and up and down the state, and I will say this is about as good as I've seen this number be in any place in California. So it's relatively mixed, is a good place to be these days compared to just pre-pandemic there. We also asked people how they would rate the city as a place to live. 79% say it is an excellent or a good place to live. Fully 29% give it the highest marks of excellent on the top of the scale. And just 21% give it an average or even a poor rating. So this, I think, is a really great underlying data point as well, that folks are generally seeing that the quality of life in their town is very good. We also asked about their views of a couple different kind of agencies involved in public life. We have the city government overall, Parks and Recreation, and the police department. We see Parks and Recreation is beloved. 82% approve of the work they're doing, compared with just 7% who disapprove of the work they're doing. For the city government, a 2-to-1 margin, approving over disapproving, 61% approving of the work you do versus 29% disapproving. And then for the police department, 57% approve and 34% disapprove. So for the most part, folks are fairly happy with these specific levels of government as well, with Parks and Recreation being a true standout, with more folks strongly approving of the work they do. We did ask favorability in 2020. This time we've asked approval. Parks and Rec's numbers have increased even in the last 4 years. City government approval or favorability rating has also increased, and police department we did not ask in 2020, so we don't have the comparison. But in general, folks, those positive impressions have been increasing. Another question we asked is, just in general, do you feel that the city has a need for additional funding for city services? And would you classify that as a great need, some need, a little need, or no real need? At the top of the chart here, you see that great need share is right around 40%. That's very strong. You have 2 in 5 voters who can see the need in the community, and fully 74% see at least some need for additional funding as well. So turning to views of a ballot measure. Our first and kind of most important task in a survey is to put something as close as possible to what they might see on their ballot in front of folks and see whether they're supportive or opposed, whether they're undecided, how strongly they feel about it. And the way we do that is with that 75-word ballot question. It's often a run-on sentence. It's got a lot of kind of legalese in there, but there are things that are kind of required by law to include. And this does hit those high points. It talks about some essential city services that would be funded, the amount of the tax, the amount it might raise, and some of those accountability provisions that would also be included as well. So this is what was shared with all voters. This has a threshold of 50% plus one for passage, since it's a general purpose measure. And what we saw is that measure has support from 7 and 10 based on that language alone. That is very strong, very, very strong for a 50% plus one measure. You, in fact, have nearly 2 in 5 who say they would definitely vote yes based on this language alone, and just 1/4 who are leaning toward a no vote. Even if you looked more strictly at just the probably and definitely votes here, you're still in the high mid 60s, which is a good place to be, again, for a measure that requires 50% plus one. So looking at it by some demographics, and we've got a good level of detail here because of the great response rate from the community. We see 2/3 or more support the measure across gender and across age, with some particular high points with folks under 40 in the community being more supportive. By party and by level of formal education, you see 81% support from Democrats, 2/3 support from independents, and 30% support from Republicans. So a very typical kind of step down pattern we see across party lines, but to have that very broad support with Democrats who are kind of big part of the community here, and 2/3 support from independents as well, is I think, key to the success of the measure. You can also see by level of education, those folks with college degrees are slightly more likely to support the measure, although those with a college degree are also supporting at a 2/3 level, very strong. Support is also broad across race and ethnicity, 76% yes with white voters, 69% yes with voters of color, so just barely a margin of error difference there. We asked people to tell us in a few words of their own, why would you vote yes on a measure like this one? And then we took their response that they either typed in or told our interviewer and put it into different categories. And here you can see the categories and percentages assigned. Those will add up to more than 100 because people could offer more than one rationale. But that's the top of the list for folks is just care for the people of the city, care for Arcata, care for the environment. People are seeing things in that ballot measure language that really speak to them and the value they assign to the place where they live. Other folks just highlighting that these are critical services. The things that are on the list are all things that they value a lot. And when they're asked for more funding, they feel supportive of it. And then you start to see a variety of other more specific rationales, like the fact that it helps invest in road repairs. It could help address homelessness. It could help address mental health issues and things like that. And here you can see a few examples of things people said in their own words. Some folks talking about the climate crisis or better walking and biking infrastructure. Some saying the tax doesn't seem like it would cost too much compared with the benefits from it. So a variety of different rationales there. On the other side of the coin, we heard from no voters. Those folks have one kind of overriding reason for voting no, and that is opposition to taxes. They just don't want to pay new taxes and vote no on them whenever they see them. You also see 28% who say they don't trust the government to spend the money wisely. Those are now and in all my 9 years in this work, usually the top 2 reasons for people to oppose a revenue measure, regardless of the mechanism, the amount, or what it would fund. But you also see a few more specific pieces, a little less common rather, but more specific, are the sense that the city's not doing enough or not doing the right things to address homelessness, and giving them more funding might double down on that. The sense that this funding would go toward police patrols and they don't like that, or the sense that not enough of this funding would go to road repairs. So a less common objection is kind of how the money is being spent. And here you can see a few examples of things opponents said. You can see, don't need more new taxes. Money is not the problem. It's corruption in government. And other folks kind of talking about cost of living. Next, we asked folks if they would be more likely to support a measure, if they would vote yes or no, if the measure were written to expire automatically after 20 years. The initial vote was written to say until ended by voters. This is putting a finer point on when it would end. We see that actually decreases support when we kind of call out the length of time that the measure would be in place. We also walked down the scale a little bit from 3/4 of a cent to 1/2 a cent to 1/4 of a cent. We do see a little bit more intensity of a yes vote as we walk down the scale, but that total yes vote really doesn't change. It's all margin of error. So I don't think there's evidence within the survey that lowering the amount would make the measure more likely to pass. Folks seem pretty comfortable at 3/4. Our next task was to look more closely at voter priorities, what is important to them in terms of how the money is spent. Here we gave people a list of services and programs that the city could provide and asked them to tell us how important each one is to them. Is it extremely important, very important, somewhat important, or not too important to you? And then we have them ranked on the next few slides in order of the share who called it either extremely or very important. So here you can see voters' top priorities for funding. They include conserving redwood forests and natural areas, providing crisis response, maintaining local roads, providing homelessness services and services to address the impacts of homelessness, repairing storm drains, and preparing for natural disaster. All of these things are valued by 4 and 5 or more, with particular passion around redwood forests. That's one that we asked about in the park survey and brought forward again this year. And then you can also see some of those accountability provisions are also really important. Public spending disclosure, requiring that funds are used locally. Those are things that are really valued in your community. Voters also broadly value things that include trash and blight cleanup, improving safety for people who are walking and biking, counseling and services for at-risk youth, bus service, trails, addressing the impacts of climate, youth programs, and again, removing carbon pollution that causes climate change from the air using trees and plants. It's kind of a long-winded way, but an evocative way of kind of talking about sort of natural climate solutions. All of those things in your community are really quite broadly valued, as well as maintaining city services more generally. 77% say that's extremely or very important to them. And then in a relative sense, we have some of the lower priorities in the community, and that includes expanding the community ambassador program beyond downtown and Northtown. Here we see 27% say they don't know, so they may just not be familiar with this program and what they do, but that's a relatively low priority for folks. Also, we see subsidies for e-bikes and home EV charging stations lower on the list, police patrols and police protection. You've got, 70-ish% or so if you add the somewhat important, but it's not as urgent as kind of that natural habitat piece and the other pieces we saw on the first slide there. We did look a little bit more closely at the demographic differences here. We saw that providing police patrols is much more broadly valued by older voters than younger ones. While 35% of those aged 50 and under called it extremely or very important, 68% of those 50 plus did. So that's a key dividing line, and we often see that on that kind of issue. We saw a similar kind of texture for maintaining police protection. 42% of voters under 50 called that extremely or very important, compared with 74% of voters aged 50 plus. And then we also saw some differences when it comes to climate. We said removing the carbon pollution that causes climate change from the air using trees and plants. That's especially important to voters under 30. 76% of them called that extremely or very important. So that's a real standout for those folks. Our next task was to provide some more information for folks to kind of really dig into what are the themes when we've got a little bit more time to give them information about the measure and the rationale. What are the things that resonate with them? And does that move their support for a measure once they kind of understand it a little bit better? And what we see is that while positive messaging increased intensity of support, we also added a critique, and that reduced the support to within the margin of error of a majority. So we're looking really great here with 72% yes in the beginning, 38% definitely yes in the beginning. After positive messaging, we move that up to 44% definitely yes, and our total yes vote stays very, very high. But after a brief critique that kind of focuses on cost of living and things like that, we're much closer, 55 to 34. So I think that's strong evidence that a measure like this would need the support of some information and help to help voters really understand the details and the rationale behind it as well to kind of keep it more in this zone here of these first two data points. So digging into some of the information that we provided, you can see here these are ranked by the share who called each very convincing as a reason to support the measure. And our kind of rule of thumb is that anything 40% or higher is a highly effective piece of information. And we see everything on this slide meets or exceeds that goal. At the top of the list is talking about the city's MIST program, describing what it does and how we could expand that with additional funding or maintain it. Also improving and investing in parks is very important to folks. That resonates quite broadly. Transit and transportation, that also resonates, as well as disaster prevention and planning and preparation. And then a message about growth, kind of contrasting Arcata from other areas of Eureka County, or Humboldt County rather, and asserting that if we invest in infrastructure, we can maintain that quality of life, which we saw earlier in the survey, people really do see as quite high. Moving down the list a bit more, all of these are fairly close to that 40% benchmark. Messages that have to do with homelessness, you see at the top and bottom of the slide. One was sort of more talking about the positives and what we can invest in. The other was talking about the cuts that might have to come without additional funding to sort of backfill the federal grants that have been providing some of these programs. Either one really does connect fairly broadly. All of these messages as well connect fairly broadly. That comparison to neighbors like Eureka and that range of services that Arcata provides, unlike any other city, like the community forest and things like that. Accountability is key, and also just simple investments in streets, repairing potholes, and making it safe to walk and bike. Moving down the list a bit more, that basics message is also fairly good. It just kind of highlights the essential services that our community needs. And then there's another tier of ones that are lower ranking. Those include a focus on youth and summer programs, a focus on climate and how we need to sort of adapt to prevent, plan to adapt, and also to prevent some of the pollution in the first place. And then one really squarely focused on police was the least persuasive of the bunch among voters overall. And here you can see the combination of the share who called each message very convincing and also somewhat convincing, the top two items on the scale. You can see the crisis response, parks, transit, those are sort of the top of the heap. Then we've got a lot of other things that are really connecting with folks, and the climate and police messages kind of being in a bottom tier. So our final task in the survey was to look at very briefly at some other policies on policymakers' minds these days in Arcata. One is about how we use space in commercial areas of Arcata. We asked people how important it is to them to use the space in this list of ways. At the top of the list, you see 84% say it is extremely or very important to them to invest in housing, and fully 60% say it's extremely important to them to invest in new housing. Sidewalks is important for 48%, extremely important rather for 48%, so nearly half. Bike lanes and trails as well. So really places for people to live and ways for people to sort of safely get around. Those are really quite highly valued in the community. Then you have a sort of second tier of things in the 60-50 range. That's restaurants and retail shops, that sort of thing. Less intensity there, but broad shares of folks saying that's at least somewhat important to them. And then you can see for street parking and parking lots, that's kind of the lowest on the list, particularly parking lots. You've got fully 25% who say that's not at all important to them. And most folks who do say it's important say it's just somewhat important. So kind of a clear set of tiers there in terms of how people want to see commercial space used. Of course, there are differences by demographics on this question. And I think a key one that we saw was by homeowner versus renter. Housing really is especially valued by renters. You can see 89% of them say it's extremely or very important use of space versus 78% of homeowners. High in either case, but much higher with renters. Otherwise, the differences are a little more muted. Homeowners maybe a little more interested in restaurants and retail shops and things like that. We also asked briefly about a few other policies being, raising the transient occupancy tax from either by 2% or by 4%. We see the 2% level is favored fairly broadly. 57% support that, compared with 53% support for the 4% increase. And then folks are a little more divided on increasing the allowable building height from 4 to 7 stories. We're at 51 to 47 there. with kind of evenly matched intensity on both sides. It's critical, though, to highlight the differences demographically on this issue, particularly when it comes to the building height question. That is something that majorities of Democrats support, and 60% of renters support as well. So again, seeing those folks in that position where they're still renting, they're more interested in those housing related policies. We also looked at this by age. We saw that increasing building height is much more broadly supported by voters under 50, those ages 18 to 29, and 30 to 39, and 40 to 49, all in that range near 3 and 5. For the transient occupancy tax, the 2% level for voters over age 30, that is very broadly supported as well. So this takes us to conclusions, and I think there's a few sort of contextual conclusions and then a few conclusions that have to do with the ballot measure language itself. Firstly, a plurality sees the city as headed in the right direction. That's down somewhat from 2020, but more positive than in other areas of the state. Voters broadly approve of city government and the Parks and Recreation Department, and those positive perceptions have increased since 2020. And while they're split on building height limits, younger voters and renters are especially supportive of those kinds of policies. Voters overwhelmingly value more housing in commercial areas more broadly, and parking is a relatively low priority for them. In a very brief conceptual test, we see broad support for a 2% increase in the TOT and a slightly less broad support for that 4% increase. When it comes to a ballot measure, we believe that with the support of communications to voters, a measure to fund essential services in Arcata is viable for November. A few data points that lead us to that conclusion include that 7 in 10 support a measure based on ballot language alone. Information in favor intensifies that support. And while adding a sunset doesn't boost support overall, those lower tax increments have slightly higher, more intense backing, so that's a potential policy lever. But success will require limited formal opposition. We saw a brief message that highlighted the cost of living, did reduce support pretty substantially to about 55%. That's where a lot of other cities, I think, are starting from. So I think it's kind of a good thing that that's your floor, but it is a little too close for comfort to that 50% and really underlines how important the information campaign would be. 3/4 of voters see at least some need for additional funding in principle, and voters have kind of a clear sense of the policies and programs they value the most. That includes the MIST program, parks, transit, disaster prevention, with policing being a relatively low priority, along with things like EV chargers. So that takes us to the end, and I'm happy to take questions.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to open it up for questions. Great presentation. Thank you so much.
May I ask a question?
Yes, absolutely.
Did anyone here get surveyed?
I did.
You did? I did. I got it.
I thought after the date.
Closed before I could do my mailbox. Oh, in your mailbox. Mine was on the phone.
I know they didn't. Well, I never answered.
Well, there were several people that went on vacation or did something. They got home and there it was, and they couldn't take it because we had already closed. I saw that. I responded that we had to do it in time for this meeting.
And so this is it, because there are, I know, probably some lingering, people out there that got the information card, but we're not adding to these responses as more people do it, or it's just, this is it.
Can you speak to that, Miranda, or speak to why you don't put a closing on deadline sort of on the survey work that you do?
Yeah, in some communities we do, but we found it can be kind of a gamble. There are some communities where folks are a lot less responsive, and so if we had said this is only going to be open for 3 days, and then it turns out that we need all those folks coming back from vacation and things like that to really weigh in, we would have shut the door on it. And then the alternative in this case is that very high response rate we had out of the gate. And so at a certain point, we have kind of enough data to draw conclusions. We've got a deadline coming up. So we stop with what we have. And we know that because we've set quotas and weighting and things like that, that it's a representative sample as well. If we had had the virtue of, you know, a full month to be in the field and things like that, we may have actually kind of put a deadline on the card and left it open longer. But I know, you know, given the pace of decision making, we had to stop at a certain point and start doing our analysis.
And just another point to make, which is that we initially contracted for 350 to 400. So we were hoping at that point in time we would get 400, and it came in at 567. So that was part of the reason that it was cut off a little earlier than expected, because people were pretty willing to share.
Do we have access to the demographic information of those who were surveyed?
Yeah, I think
Because
it
that
was,
wasn't included, and I don't think I saw that.
I thought it
There was some there, yes, but we do.
We'll
Okay,
probably
but
get
just-
a little bit more, we
yeah.
get the numbers.
Yeah.
Who we send it out to, is that what you mean?
Yeah.
So what demographic are you looking for? I'm just curious.
I'm just curious in the, you know, the spread of age and race and gender and, you know, all the things. I'm just interested in the spread to see, because, you know, as Miranda said, it was a pretty representative sample, but I'm just generally curious as somebody that, you know, nerded out on social science statistics in college, so.
Yeah, we have all of that data. It is a representative sample, so we, you know, looking at the counts for the November turnout, we made sure that the data matches that. So by, you know, race and ethnicity, by age, by level of education, by gender, by party registration, it matches that profile for November 2024.
I do really appreciate having this presentation before we go into goal setting, so this was really good time. Thank you so much.
I would just ask, Miranda, is there, I mean, you do this type of work all over the state, you know, and how would you compare what you saw in Arcata to sort of what you're seeing maybe in rural areas statewide, or even just statewide in general?
Yeah, I think, you know, Arcata is a unique community. I've visited a few times and definitely got a sense of that. And I think we see that in the survey. There are a lot of places throughout California that are grappling with some big problems, homelessness, crime, cost of living, cost of housing in particular. And I think you all are no stranger to those issues, but folks are feeling pretty uniquely slightly positive, as we saw in that right direction, wrong track question. They feel like their quality of life is quite good. And I think in some of those questions where we sort of compare Arcata to other communities, people kind of know that they've got, you know, a good quality of life, and maybe is sort of bucking the trend for the state overall. And so I was, you know, a little surprised to see how strong the numbers were, considering what we're seeing in other communities. The cost of living is just a big concern for folks. But I think as we're reading through the responses people gave in the open ends and looking at all the rest of the data, it's pretty clear that people want to protect the quality of life they have here. And they really do value the services you provide, not just those core ones like streets and parks and things like that, but some of the unique ones that you're also providing, like the MIST program or community forests and some of the work you do on climate. So I think it's a unique community, and that's why these results are really so strong, is people reflect the work you do and believe that it could use additional funding to protect that quality of life that they value.
I'd like to ask one other question, because we're going to the county is going to have a ballot measure also to increase, I think it's 0.5 cent. And Fortuna is going to be doing the same thing in Arcata. So there's at least 3 entities that are going to have ballot measures that are going to be dealing with increases. So I just wonder how that'll affect us when they're going to have the county and they're going to have Arcata.
Our folks will have potentially 2 ballot measures on their ballot, and certainly having 2 is not desirable. We would have gone in March if we could have, but the November election is our only city municipal general election, and therefore we had to go in November. You know, I think we'll see. You did polling also for the county. I'd be happy. I did get their PowerPoint from the county too. If you would like me to share that with the council, I'd be happy to do so.
I just wonder how they polled.
It's good to live in Arcata, that's what I'm gonna tell you.
They pulled well in Arcata.
Yeah.
And so that would be then a county-wide sales tax increase plus an individual within the city of Arcata increase.
Eureka is 3/4% higher than Arcata is right now. And that was the measure that they brought, it'll be 4 years ago. And I think Fortuna is right where we are now, and they are also looking. Maybe only.
And you said 0.5% is what the county is looking at?
It is, and they're looking, I mean, it won't be a specific tax, they will be looking at a general tax, but it is gonna be earmarked towards roads,
You said for roads.
for roads.
Yeah, so HCA says they're hoping that they'll be able to get a percentage of that money so that they can be whole, because right now they operate on grants. And if they could get a percentage, because the county's is indefinite, it'll be forever. They don't have a date on it, is my understanding. And, and then they can go for grants to do, HCA can go out for grants to do, see if they can do, busy times, morning and night, if they can do 15-minute buses running or this and that, put other services in through grants and not have to operate through grants. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, and one of the dynamics that is at play is that we've seen, you know, less and less money coming from what was originally Measure Z dollars at the county that was being distributed out to the cities. This will be, we don't get any Measure Z money again this year. This will be the second year in a row. It looks like we are right below the funding level that, you know, they're doing an increase to the rural fire areas again this year, which leaves most of the cities out of contention for Measure Z funds. So that is a struggle, because like our juvenile diversion program has been funded under Measure Z, our school resource officer has been funded under Measure Z. We picked up the cost for this last year to keep juvenile diversion whole, but we recognize that that's not sustainable within the funding that we have. So that was, you know, again, one of the triggers for us to be looking at how do we fund some of these programs long term, some that we've had for a long time, and then some of the newer ones like Community Ambassador and MIST and programming out in the Valley West area that, you know, the community has seen some success with in the last couple of years that they may want to continue.
We must advise each other, because I wrote down juvenile diversion and I heard you. I just want to clarify, we didn't actually state that particular program, but it could still be funded through our measure, correct?
Oh, yeah, we could have listed, you know,
Everything.
another
Okay.
100 programs. We
Sure.
really did trust Miranda and, you know, the FM3 team. I know when you see the language associated with the survey, sometimes it looks funky. All of us could have wordsmithed that in a different way. We all wanted to, but then we trusted Miranda, who does this work a lot out in communities, to be able to succinctly get people through to get what has proven over time to be fairly, you know, statistically accurate survey work.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I think the concept is looking at the categories that are of value
Yeah.
and figuring out,
What
you
that
know,
could, that fit under it.
yeah, and where does that, I mean, by the end of the night tonight, looking at where your goals and priority projects are, and then where those crossovers are between what the council brings in the community and what the survey says.
And this might come to everyone else. I'm trying to backtrack to the TOT, the 2% versus 4%. I thought it would be different, so I'm trying to understand why.
I asked Miranda this question around, you know, sort of the sunset clause as well, and I think, in part, people maybe don't understand fed tax as much. You know, I do think there is some appetite, or we've seen success in this region around raising TOT or fed tax, because it's not typically paid by those who live locally. So why, I don't know, Miranda, if you have a sense of why that would have pulled lower?
The 2 versus the 4%, or lower than the sales tax?
Well, for me, lower than the sales tax.
Yeah, so I think, you know, the sales tax did really well because we were actually testing ballot measure language, which includes almost half of it is talking about the actual things that, you know, we'll spend the money on. Stormwater, roads, parks, police, emergency response, homelessness, everything. Whereas in this survey, we'd had just the briefest looked at, would you support or oppose this concept, this mechanism? So it doesn't include all of that nice stuff that you get as a result. If we had done a fair test of, you know, and had more time in the survey to devote to the TOT, I think we would have, you know, written it in a similar fashion where it says, you know, to increase spending, you know, to increase funding for XYZ, shall we do this and that? And I think it would have done better in that case. We often find TOTs are pretty palatable to voters.
So it could have definitely went to 4% had we had it defined more what that money could be used for. They may have even, between the 2 and the 4, could have been higher.
I think you could certainly build support for TOT. Now, the difference in the money that we generate between a TOT and a sales tax is also substantial.
Yeah.
I mean, sales tax is what really is gonna bring in funding at a level to sustain some of the programs that you.
So, do you have something you wanna?
Well, I mean, we haven't, I don't think we've really discussed yet if we wanted to
Right,
do
that's what I was gonna
both,
say.
but I mean, for me, with the county having a measure and then our sales tax being very important because of the amount that we'll get from it, I would hate to dilute it, confuse people, have people choose the TOT over sales or whatever. Like,
Yeah.
I think we should just keep it simple
Yeah.
and just ask for the one.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I know that this is a study session and we're not doing any decision-making tonight, but will this come back to the council for us to decide which one?
It will be. You are, certainly can feel free as a study session to give us very clear direction.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I agree with Casey. I think that, what,
Yeah, no,
Betsy, hold on.
I just have another question.
Oh.
Going down the runners. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay, go ahead.
Putting my hand up. so you
Okay,
can see me.
go ahead.
I want you to ask about Measure G. Is that done and over with?
No, Measure G is not done and over with. It is, I should have brought my cheat sheet. It is up in 2028. Yeah, so this would be in addition to our Measure G dollars.
Okay.
And in polling for, you know, the sunset, having a sunset clause or no sunset clause, you know, I think the sentiment, at least Miranda, that you shared earlier, is that the voters are like, these are needs in our community, they're not gonna go away on year 21. So if these are priorities, we wanna fund them and we wanna fund them into the future.
And just to be clear, I agree with you. I was just trying to understand.
Oh, absolutely.
Why it was the way it was, because intuitively for me, I was like, of course they're gonna go for 4%, but they didn't, and that makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, I think that we're pretty much, are we all in consensus that we'll just focus on the
That's where I would be.
sales, okay.
Only select one.
yeah, definitely.
Yeah, let's not dilute that message, I think.
Because we'll try to we are gonna try to bring this back to you sooner rather than later, just to keep this on track and so that you have time to
Yeah, I'm looking at the
publicly,
timeline, yeah.
review it and look at least once or twice and have the attorney. Can I ask that, the amount that you're supportive of, is it the 3/4 or?
I think the 3/4.
Okay,
Going for it.
okay, thank you.
Right. Well, thank you so much. I think that if there's no other questions, I think we're ready to move on.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Have a good night.
All right.
Did Alice get her question answered?
Yes, she did.
Okay.
Measure G.
Okay, good.
All right, so we are now